Hey guys, what's up? So it is 8:30 in the morning, and I was actually going to work on a project that I've been involved in for quite some time, an open source project. So I was going to implement a feature, or rather uh, uh, introduce a tool, or rather utility to the project. So it is kind of a well-known utility, but at the same time a bit confusing. So I thought that I should make a little tutorial for it. Not exactly a tutorial, it's kind of a quick walkthrough. So let's take a look at the project and the utility that we'll be introducing. So Pocket Science Lab, you can just Google it, and the Pocket Science Lab desktop application is the one that I'm contributing to. Interesting tool. It's kind of a interface for an open hardware. That is what it is called. The schematics and everything are available, and you can create your own PS Lab boards royalty free. It's cool stuff. I'm working on the second version of the desktop app, in which we are using the Python Electron and React stack, and it has been going good so far. Then the utility itself that we are going to work on, or rather introduce to our project. So I'm pretty sure you must have heard about Redux, because if you're using React at some point of time, you'll come across this utility, and inevitably you'll have to, introduce this to your project. So if you have a senior developer who has quite some experience in web application development, then he'll probably do the setup for you. But if you are the only guy working on the project, then you'll be forced to do it on your own. So here, for today's video session, what we'll be talking about is what is Redux, why do you need Redux, and how to actually introduce this to the project that you're working on. So I've been reading a few articles and everything for that, so I'll be adding them to the description, and I would really suggest to go through them in the order that I describe them in. So there's a very nice article which we'll be going through in a second. So firstly, let's make a clear distinction between a few libraries. So the thing is, Redux itself is basically a concept, and it can be used pretty much in anything, a vanilla JavaScript application, or maybe an AngularJS application, maybe on the server side. It can be used just about anywhere because it's a concept. It's not exactly a library. And the concept that it is based on is pretty interesting. We'll talk about that in detail in a minute. So, but the thing is, because Redux is so popular and much popular in the React community, there is a dedicated binding for React, which is called React-redux. So React-redux is separate from this Redux library. They do they both of them do exactly the same thing, but the React-redux comes with how to put this, batteries included kind of thing. So it is much tuned and optimized for React, and at the same time it will make development easier for you, because it will do much of the tough part of your coding under the hood, so you don't have to worry about subscribing or making optimized state changes. So those things will be taken care of by React Redux library. So the distinction is we are not going to explicitly install Redux in our application. We'll install React Redux, which in turn depends on Redux, and yeah, so that should be it for the library distinction. Then now let's talk about the concept in an abstract fashion, and then we'll get down to actually coding this. Alright, so this is the article that I was reading. It's a great article. So I have read this article already, so I'll just quickly surf through this so that you can read this at your own pace, but at the same time understand this. So yeah, so what is Redux? So like I said, it's a concept, and it is built on 3 principles. So the first principle is single source of truth. The second principle is state is read only, and the third principle is changes are made with pure functions. So let's take a look at these 3 principles one by one. Source of truth is basically like, even before we can talk about these principles, I think I should describe the components that make up Redux so that these 3 principles become more clear. So any application that uses Redux will have 3 basic components no matter what. Now the way they are used or the way they are described may be different, so I hope that doesn't create a confusion later on. So every application will have a single store. Single in the sense there are architectures where you can have multiple stores, but Redux does not follow that. Redux will always have a single store for the whole application. Then we have reducers. I mean, for the sake of easier development, reducers are usually split into multiple reducers and later combined, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just represent it like this. And then we have actions. So yeah, so actions and actually this is all there is to the Redux flow. But if you were to imagine this, I mean, if you ask the question, where does your React component or components fit in? So it would be here. This is your React DOM tree, virtual DOM or whatever you want to call it. And the store will pass down the state value to this component. And say your component, one of your child component wishes to make change to, say, the store, then it will trigger an action. So this is how the whole thing works. So you have a component, you want to make change to the store, so you dispatch an action. What is an action exactly? That will get down to when we'll be actually going through the article. This is just an abstract idea. So it dispatches an action, the action is uh, I mean the action is received by the reducers, and the reducers then decide how to make changes to the store. And as soon as your store gets changed, this is again passed down to your React tree as props, and wherever your components require these state values will automatically pick this up. So let's go back to the article we were reading. um, yeah, so single source of truth. So like I said, we have a single store. The store itself is a single entity, and it is the truth for your whole application. So anything that conflicts with your store value can be considered a false value, because the truth that we are considering is the store itself, and single because we just have one store according to the Redux architecture, so single source of truth. uh, then we have state as read only, which basically means you are not allowed to directly change the store values. There is a proper chain of events that need to happen for the store values to change. So you have to dispatch an action, which in turn will be picked up by the reducer. The reducer then decides how to make changes to the store. A component cannot directly pick up the store values and make changes to it as it feels like. So um, state is read only, hence state is read only. Then uh, changes are made with pure functions. So firstly, what are pure functions? So pure functions are functions that are predictable and that uh, don't depend. Firstly, they don't depend on any kind of unpredictable value. For example, date, maybe, maybe time. Because see, whenever you trigger this function, these values will be different. So you cannot predict the output of the pure function. So pure functions cannot depend on entities that are non-predictable in nature. Secondly, pure functions are not allowed to make changes to the argument that they are called with. So if you pass a pure function with, say, some object value, or maybe some value rather, so your pure function will not make changes to this. What it can do is basically create a new entity and passing that entity to wherever required. So yeah, it might be a bit confusing, because if it is not allowed to make any change or anything like that, then how will it actually make changes to the store? So uh, the thing is, the store is a JavaScript object, and your reducer basically creates a new object every time an action is fired. How it can create a new object is again totally it's something that you'll see while we code. If you have ever heard of spread operator, it can be used for creating new objects. Just copying the old object to the new one and then returning the new object. So just keep in mind that you cannot make changes to the old object, but you have to return a new object according to pure function terminology. So that is it, the three principles based on which Redux works. Now with that in mind, let's take a look at this diagram, because now we need to talk about why we actually need Redux. There is already an architecture for managing state in React itself, class components which come with their own states. Now the problem is, if you were not using Redux and say this component, let's call this A, let's avoid confusion, let's call this child 1, and this component is child 2, and this as parent. So you have a value that is being shared between the two, child A and child B. So as you know, obviously you have to keep the state values in the parent component. Now if this child were to be uh, quite deep in the dormitory, 15, 16 levels down, then this state would have to be passed onto like a waterfall thing straight from the parent component to every component that is a parent of, that is a uh, ancestor of this child B. And um, now if this component child A is able to make changes to anything related to child B, then again you'll have to define a function in the uh, common parent, common ancestor of the two, and then again pass the function down to the component that is able to call that function and make changes to the state values that are being used by child B. So that becomes really hectic and verbose, and your code becomes really messy. The readability in turn starts to decrease. I mean, if I were to show you right now, um, my code base is suffering from something like that. So this is the state of my oscilloscope component. This is a huge state, and this is being passed on to the setting, and the setting passes on to the other panels, and so on and so forth. So we can avoid this completely by using Redux. So what Redux does is, like I said, it creates a store, and this store has nothing to do with any of the components. I mean, this is the application state, that's it. So wherever you need it, you just directly give it to the component using a utility provided by the React-redux library, which we'll talk about in a second. uh, like I mean, it is called connect higher order component, or a function, wrapper function. Higher order component is a wrong term, I think. I mean, it's a wrapper function which is provided by the React Redux library, using which you can directly pass the values to the component, so you don't have to, pass it down from the parent. So that is something. And at the same time, if you need to call, I mean, if you need to make any changes to that particular state that child B is using, you have to define actions, which again can be directly accessed by the component, so you don't have to pass it down from the parent. So component becomes much more cleaner, much more clean, not cleaner, sorry, much more clean. And at the same time, it becomes easier for you to use the whole state. But the only thing that you need to sacrifice here is the data flow thing, I should say, because here this actually breaks the um, waterfall data flow that React has. So should not be a problem. If you can wrap your head around this, you should not be having much problem later on. Should be pretty easy. Alright, so that is why we need it. And in fact, there's a saying in the Redux community that if you're confused whether or not to use Redux, then you probably don't need it. But in our case, I definitely need Redux for this, because our development has been stuck for a few days because of something that can only be fixed by Redux. So we are going to introduce that. Now, now we'll talk about the code, as in how to introduce Redux. There are a few more things that I think will be covered in a later session, which is asynchronous actions, but for now things are synchronous, and we'll be talking about that. So my advice would be to just read the basic tutorial part of the Redux library first. So read this link, sorry, not this link, the actions first. It is quite briefly described, and I think is elaborate enough for you to understand what actions are. Then there are reducers, then there are store. Data flow can be skipped if you want. Usage with Redux will be something that we'll be talking about anyway with React Redux. So let me quickly breeze through this article, not article, doc, or whatever you want to call it. So actions are, you know what, you can read this at your own pace, but from, I mean, a bird's eye view for this would be actions are basically JavaScript objects that are passed, or rather dispatched by the action. Uh, I mean, you have to dispatch an action which will be picked up by the reducer. So an action looks like this. It has a type and it has a data that you want to send to the reducer, which your reducer will use to modify the Redux store. In our case, we will be using a term called payload instead of text like here. We'll be using payload, which will make it look much more uniform, because every action will have a type and a payload, type and a payload. So, uh, so the app structure is actually, as they suggest, they say that you should have action types. You know what? Let me write this down. So there will be 4 components. In fact, the way it is suggested is you create a folder called reducer in your application, which will have another folder called action types. Then you'll have another folder called reducers, and one more folder called action creators. It should be action creators actually, but you can call it actions if you want, no issues. And a file which will be store.js. That's it. So actions, here you'll have all the actions, here you'll have all the reducers, here you'll have all the action types. So in this article they have talked about how and why you should follow this particular structure. It actually becomes more readable. So action types, so in our case I'll be working on a feature, the snack bar feature. If you know what snack bars are, I'll show all this in a second. So in that I'll have to declare 2 action types for now. So 2 action types, and those action types will be used in your action creator. And the thing is, what action creators are, I said actions are basically JavaScript objects that will be dispatched. Action creators are basically functions to which you pass some data, and they'll do the hard part of adding the type to it and adding the payload to it if any kind of modification is needed. So that is what action creators are. It's nothing very fancy. It's just a function that returns an action. That's it. And as you know, actions have this format. So if you read this, it should be clear. Then of course the dispatch function itself, you should not be worried about this right now, because this will be taken care of by the React-redux library, so you can avoid getting into much detail in that. But the thing is, the dispatch function takes an action creator as an argument, and it dispatches it basically for your reducers to pick it up. But you need not worry about this right now. So your code will look something like this. So you have action types declared in a separate folder. In this, they just have written everything at one place for readability's sake. So you have action types. You have created your action creators. So these are action creators. This is, I don't know what this is. Need not worry about this. Then you come over to reducers. So reducers are again, now the thing is, for larger applications, it is suggested that you write multiple reducers in your reducer folder, But if your application is really small, you can actually manage everything with a single file, single reducer. But in our case, we'll have to write multiple reducers. But in this walkthrough, I'll just write one, and we'll show you how to actually combine multiple reducers if it scales to that. So in basically, reducers are nothing but a massive switch statement. Uh, so what your reducer, I mean, it is a function which has a switch statement, and the reducer itself takes two arguments. One is the action itself that will be dispatched by your dispatch function, and the state. Now, the state is usually the previous state that your store had, and when your store is not initialized, as in it does not have a previous state, in that case, you have to define an initial state that you would be using. So initial state is basically anything that like that will be used for initialization of the store. So you have to define it just above this function and pass it as a default argument to the state value. And in the switch statement, make sure to return this particular state as default, because this will be mandatory stuff, because when your app initializes, this default statement is triggered. Without this, your state initialization won't work. So if you take a look at this code, this is basically, if I don't pass any state, then this initial state value will be used. And as you know, if no actions match that you have defined, then this will be used, which is basically equivalent to a return initial statement. Initial state. Sorry. So yeah, there's that. And in reducers, there are, like I've said, you're not allowed to modify the previous state directly. You'll have to copy that whole object and return it. So yeah, here they are using object.assign. I tend to use the spread operator, which makes life a bit more easier. I'll show you that in a second. Then handle more actions. So here they have basically given so this is the structure, how you would do it actually, right? And then you have splitting reducers, which is totally up to you. I would not be splitting reducers because that tends to get in my way as far as readability is concerned, so I won't be doing that. But if you feel like doing it, you can go for it. So I mean, it basically, if you read this is basically fragmenting the state into even smaller chunks and writing functions to deal with those small chunks, and then combining them into a bigger reducer. So a utility that we will be using from the Redux library is combined reducers. Combined reducers is basically used for combining multiple reducers, and what this returns is basically the reducer function tied up to a key value. So this is important because your state, the store value, the state itself, will be basically a key value pair, right? So whatever initial value your reducer function returns will be tied to this key that you pass to combined reducer, and will basically form the whole structure of your store. So you are free to let combined reducer pick the function, reducer name itself as the key, or you can pass your own key. We'll be passing our own key, so I'll be showing that. And then finally, you combine all the reducers and pass it to the store. You can read through this is very easy, right? Then you define the store. So create store will be the Redux utility we'll be using for creating stores, and you just pass whatever reducer you created. So in our case, we use the combined reducer here rather than in the reducer folder itself. So yeah, you just pass the reducer here, and the create store utility will take care of the rest. Alright, so you can go ahead and test everything here, but you don't really need to. That is all there is. You need to read from this uh, Redux documentation, and then you can close it if you want. There's a separate utility that we'll be using. It's actually called bind action, I think. But I'll talk about that um, when we actually write the code for it. So you'll get to know why we are using it. If I just say why we are using it right now, you might miss the essence of its use. So uh, okay, now you can hop over to okay, yeah, then I would recommend reading this article completely A to Z. It's very nicely written, and the workflow and everything, the initial state I was talking about, it's all there. You can read this. It's very beautifully written. So I've already read this, so I will be closing this. Then you can come over to the React-redux part, in which oh damn it, I almost forgot that I had breakfast.
A few moments later.
Let's talk about React-redux now. So this library basically provides two major utilities that will be required for the React library. So your components, the topmost component of your app, will be wrapped around by this provider. You import this from your React Redux library and wrap your whole component around this. And this takes the store that we created using Redux in a, I mean, we just talked about it. So you have to pass that as a prop to this provider. This is a higher order component. This will take care of passing the store values down to every component that falls under it. So this is a utility, and it makes life easier for you because you don't have to worry about passing the state values yourself. And the connect is basically used for subscribing to store changes and at the same time accessing store values and action creators, um, basically the store values that are passed by the provider. And uh, this will also give you the dispatch function, which you can use to dispatch your actions that you happen to generate using your action creators. So these two are the only things that will be required from this library, at least. So that's it, and we can get started with actually writing the code for it. So um, yeah, so the other things that I was talking about is asynchronous actions, and also we can skip that because that's kind of an advanced stuff, so you don't need to know about that right now. So let me first show you what is the current status of the app. So the file to which I'll be making changes is the app.js file, and this is currently a totally class-based, I mean a React class-based component, so this has its own state and everything. And to be very exact, for this walkthrough I'll be converting this snack bar state to a Redux state and passing this snack bar value down to app.js so that snack bar can open and close uh, using the Redux library, and we'll completely remove this state from here and anything that is dependent on this state for the snack bar. So how does the app actually looks like? Let me just quickly run it and show you. As soon as your app, I mean, as soon as my app opens The snack bar is dispatched using a function that I've described in app.js, and you should see the snack bar open here, and this state value is changed using that function, and your snack bar opens. There it is, device not connected, and it closes using a similar function that I had described in app.js. So the functions are uh, on close snack bar, on open snack bar. These two functions are making changes in the state that I've described for the snack bar here. So now let's convert this into Redux. So firstly, we need to install React-redux. So let's do that first. There we go. So you can see that React Redux has been installed. But the thing is, you'll need Redux to create the store. React Redux is just for the bindings, so you'll need to install Redux separately for creating the store. So yeah, I think we should install that right now. Yep. Yep, there we go. So we have Redux and React Redux as well. So we're good to go. We can start by creating the reducer folder, the Redux folder, in which, the structure that I described, I'll be writing exactly that. We'll start with writing actions, then firstly we'll write the action type, then we'll write the actions, then we'll write the reducer, and then finally combine that and create a store. After that, we'll circle back to the React component itself. So let's start. Yeah, so I cannot hold the mic and type at the same time, but I'll just give you a brief idea of my project structure. So source is where all the React stuff happens. So I'll firstly create a new folder here, Redux, then a file named store.js inside it. There it is. Then a folder, action types. Yeah. Then actions. These are not exactly actions, these are action creators, but for the sake of readability and consistency, we'll write actions there. And then you have the reducers. Now it's totally up to you what kind of segregation you're looking for. So as snack bar itself is part of something that is related to the app itself and not some specific component, so I'll create a separate section in my store which will be responsible for these things like username, snack bar state, the dialog box state that opens. So these things will be taken care of by this particular segment of the store. So if I were to draw you a picture, it would be something like this. That is how I hope my store will look like at the end. So if this is your whole component, state object, I'm writing this as store. This is the JavaScript object. So I have an app key which will hold all the details like snack bar, state, and maybe username, I don't know, whatever that is relevant to your whole app. Let's say then you wish to define something else that is component specific, then you can just write the name of the component, for example oscilloscope, blah blah blah, and then again define it like this. So this gives you a clear segregation. And the fun thing is, for every little segregation you do, a very clear way to write this is basically defining one reducer for one segment and one action file for one segment. So this makes it really easy to understand and see and debug later on. So let's go there, and you'll have app.js. I'm writing this as small because these are not components, these are simple JavaScript files. And in actions we have same app.js, and in reducer again you have same app.js. So we are basically writing action types, actions, and reducers for this particular key that I showed you in the state. And when I'm finally finished, this is what will be generated in your Redux store. Alright, so here we go. So these are the two actions that I actually need for the snack bar. So one will be the open snack bar action type, and one will be the close action snack bar type. This will be used for basically both by the reducer and the action. So now that we are done with action types, let's now create the action creators. Yeah, so I've just named the function for now. So these two functions will be basically used by the component itself. So in our case it is app.js. So this component itself will use these two functions to open and close the snack bar. So think of it as, it is not exactly this, but I'm just trying to draw an analogy. So here it is somewhat similar to this. There are major differences, so don't get confused, but we are defining counterparts for these two functions in our actions. So as I said, this is action creator. So this is a function that returns an action. This is not something that dispatches an action. This just returns an action. So you know what the action type for this open snack bar will be. It will have a type and a payload. Now for opening a snack bar, as far as my application is concerned, I plan to pass three things: Um the message, the timeout, and variant. Variant is not exactly being used right now, so I don't plan on uh, making use of it right now. So we can skip this argument. So message and timeout. So we'll pass exactly that here as well. Also remember that your user, I mean the the programmer who will be using your actions, or action creator should I say, may forget to actually pass the arguments, or may choose not to use these arguments. In that case, you'll have to manage and you'll have to handle the case where he's not passing anything by giving them default values. So ESX supports these features where you can pass default values for um, arguments. This is basically object restructuring. You can read about that. It's kind of a common way of doing things. So let's now define the action itself. So this is the open snack bar action. It has the payload that I plan to deliver to the Redux, that I plan to deliver to the reducer, and the type that will be used to detect which kind of action this is. Same way I can. There's an interesting thing to note here is that I have not passed the is open value here, because you see I know that is open will be true when open snack bar is dispatched rather. So I can just directly use that in my reducer. I'll show you how to do that, and I'll write something similar for close snack bar. In close snack bar, you actually don't need to pass any payload, because you just need to tell the reducer that I want to close the snack bar, so it will just change the value of is open in the state. So you are not actually required to pass anything. So in that case, I'll just copy this, paste it here, remove the payload, and change this to close snack bar, and you're done. So we have defined our action creators. Now let's move on to writing the reducers for it. Now remember that in the documentation it said that previous state will, this is basically previous state, and initially it doesn't have a state, so previous state will be undefined. In that case, you'll have to pass something to this for initialization. So we'll pass initial value, but again we haven't described what initial value is, so firstly we need to describe that. So let's do that first. So here this picture should be kept in mind. You are describing this in your initial state, so it will be everything that app key should be holding. So other than snack bar, there will be many other things that will coming here. So I'll be describing basically a snack bar key, and for that all the relevant values will be stored here in the initial state. So uh, initially the snack bar stays closed. The message value is something, some string. No, I mean no string. It's a string with no value. Yeah, and the timeout is set to 4 seconds, I guess. So you can just copy paste that from the app.js state, and here it is. Just copy paste that here. So this will be the initial state. Seems about right. And you can then just copy paste the initial value to the previous state. Now we'll be writing the switch statement that I talked about. So here your action is passed whatever is being dispatched, it will be passed here, and it's now your job to detect which action it is and describe the state that you want to return. So keep this structure in mind and make changes accordingly. So we have two actions that we'll be dealing with right now. So let's first import the action types so that we can compare them here. So for open snack bar, what we want to do is, we know that the action will come with this payload. So we'll firstly destructure this payload, and then we'll make a copy of this object, make changes accordingly, and then return that object. So it will be a new object. We are not mutating the original state, so we are following the 3 principles of Redux. So let's see how to do that. So firstly, action.payload will carry the value that we want to set in this state. Now here I'm returning a new object, but we need to copy it first because we'll lose the values otherwise. So we'll use the spread operator here. Sorry, not the initial state, previous state. So there we go. This is the object that we'll be returning. And one more thing we forgot is open should be set to true whenever this reducer is triggered. So here it is. Similarly, for close snack bar, we'll do something same. We'll change the value of is open to false, and also we'll basically revert back to the initial state and not something else. So in fact, if you want, you can just spread this here. So yeah, I think it will work, but Mm, I think it's better to do this because this looks more readable that way. Alright. And finally, like I said, initialization is done by Redux. So in that case, initial state will be used, but which action will be triggered while initialization? So that is not up to you. That is done by the Redux library itself, and whichever action is not in your switch case should return the initial state no matter what. That is how the initialization works. So return the initial state, that's it. So that's it, I think. Um, for the sake of consistency, I think we should just copy this as well, because that is what the principle says. So we cannot reuse the object, we have to create another copy every time. So there it is, and our reducer is ready. So now let's move on to the store. So there's a utility that we need to use, that is the create store, and at the same time another utility that we'll be using for merging multiple reducers that we'll be writing later on. As of now, that there's just one, but we'll need to write more later, so let's just make sure that we are able to scale. So what combine reducer does is basically it digests an object, and the key value pair of this object will be used to create a complete reducer, and this basically defines the structure that I was talking about. So here we had written something called the app reducer, which will take care of managing the state for this app key. But how will your store know about this app key? So this is where the combine reducer will be used. So firstly we need to import that reducer that we wish to combine, and then define the key here. So it will be like this. So this is how the structure is. So app reducer will take care of app. So finally when the store is created, anything, I mean the state will be something like this. So app and whatever app related things you have done in the reducer. So the initial state should be kept in mind while visualizing this. So the initial state, everything here will be equal to app here. And when you define more reducers, so oscilloscope or XYZ, whatever, then you can define another reducer here, and so on and so forth. So it will be pretty simple from here. Now let's finally create the store. So create store basically takes in a reducer as an argument. So let me just quickly check that. Yep, and there we are. So the store is created, the action types are created, the action creators are created, and the reducers as well. Finally, we can start by actually integrating this into our app. So first and foremost, for you to make use of connect wrapper function so that you can access the store and the dispatch function, you need to make sure that your component is wrapped around the provider utility. Now the thing is, the app itself was kind of acting as the root component for my app, but the problem is I am accessing the store. I plan to access the store right here, app.js, so I cannot use provider in app.js, but a parent of app.js. So a parent of app.js is index.js, where I actually use the React DOM to, this is the standard boilerplate. So I'll have to import the store here, and also the provider utility. So let's do that here. So there we go. We have wrapped the app component and provider. So everything in app, every child of it, will be able to access this now. Access the store, so we can use connect anywhere in the app we want. So for now, we want to use it in app.js. So we can start by getting rid of this from the app state, because we won't be needing this anymore. Yeah, so the whole snack bar thing goes away. Yeah, so firstly, let's wrap this up in connect. So uh, connect takes two functions as input. So one is map state to props and map dispatch to props. I'll tell exactly what they're used for in a second. Let me just quickly describe them here. Now here's the funny thing. The thing is, okay, you know what? Map state to props basically is a function that will take, I mean, the connect component will handle how to call these functions. You don't have to worry about that. What you need to look out for is map state to props will take the store itself as its first argument, as its only argument, and then it's up to you what you want to return to your app. So this, I mean, whatever you return from map state to props will be passed down to your component as props, so you'll be able to access that. So here we actually want to access the app part of our store, so that is why I have returned store.app here. uh, if you wanted to access more than that, it's totally up to you. You can just return an object, and I mean, it's totally up to you what you want to return. So you'll be able to access the store by store.app, store.app, store.xyz, or whatever you want. Just pass it down to the component. Whatever you pass here will be given to your component as props. All right. And then we have map dispatch to props. Here is where things get interesting. Remember I talked about that dispatch function which is used to dispatch the actions returned by your action creator. Well, map dispatch to props takes that function as its first argument. Now what you ideally would want to return is key value pairs, where each key represents a function, and that function, when, I mean, it should look like this. See, so what the dispatch function takes as argument is the action creator. So you have to import all the actions that you want to use in this component. So this is what it would ideally look like. So in whenever you would want to use this, um, you know what? Let me just show you how to use this, and then we'll talk about um, how to actually avoid calling this dispatch function every time. Because you see, when there are many, this again, the pros of this is that you'll have full control over what you are dispatching and how you're dispatching. But sometimes this control is not needed and becomes verbose without any reason, so you can just avoid this. So there's a nice tool that comes with the Redux library that we'll be using. But before that, let's see how to actually call this, and maybe later improve this. All right. So in the renderer, the snack bar itself was taking a function to close itself. So we have passed the close snack bar from props. If you're wondering how this function got into props, this is where the map dispatch to props was used for. The map dispatch to props basically, yeah, so it basically returns an object, and yeah, I better not be messing this up. Yeah, for that actually there is this article which will actually make your life easier. Ways to connect. So this basically describes what are the ways of making use of this. So yeah, we are going in the right direction. So this is the uh, you know default way of doing this. So as you see, every time this is being called using this. So so yes, and don't forget to call this, right? Because you have to call this function to return the action that will be dispatched. So you have to call that function. So I'm calling this here, I'm calling this here. We do not need those two functions anymore because we have written their counterparts in Redux. So if the states don't exist here, so we don't need to worry about the functions that will be making changes to the those states. And here I think we have, this is not needed here. I think here we have called this the open snack bar. Yeah. Okay. Alright, so everything looks good and I hope nothing breaks. Should work right now. Alright, something broke. Module not found, can't resolve. Actions. Oh. Yeah, sorry. Open snack bar is not exported from. Seriously? Oh, it's small beat, damn it. Yeah. open snack bar is not a function. This is definitely a function. Oh, what's wrong with this naming? Damn it. Yeah, that is why sometimes I just hate code predictions. Yeah, so it's working. Now, let's improve upon it. What we are using is wrap into dispatch manually, which we are doing right now, but we are adding extra code for something that can be done automatically. Now, the map dispatch to props supports this feature where you just pass the action creator directly and it will take care of wrapping it up, but you lose control over it. So that is where the bind action creators comes in from the Redux library. So we'll import this and I'll tell you what it does exactly. So what action bind action creators does is basically it so basically whatever you uh, it takes an object and the dispatch function as its second argument, object as the first argument, and the object key value pair is basically the action creators. So what it does is it returns the exact same object with the same name, same everything, but it just wraps it with the dispatch function. So that basically abstracts away the exact same thing that we are doing. So this point number 4 is what we are using actually, because we need full control, but at the same time we don't want to lose the abstraction that we could get. So what we'll do is we'll return everything the same way, but we'll use this bind action creator and use the spread operator here. So this will spread these two with dispatch wrapped around this in our object that we are passing as props. And then if you want further control, then you can define uh, other keys with dispatch being done manually, so you can do that as well. So you get best of both worlds. So we'll do exactly that here. Now it should still work the same. There we are. See, so we have removed any kind of verbose code from here, but at the same time we are achieving the same functionality. And now if I were to add another action, say XYZ, and I wanted to manually dispatch it, I'm free to do it, because I'll just have to describe a function here and call dispatch here manually, the way we were doing here previously. So that's it. So this is how you're supposed to integrate Redux into your app. And as you see, we have removed the snack bar state, and it is being stored in the Redux store. Excuse me. So that's it. If you have further questions, ping me directly if you want, or drop a comment or whatever you want. I'll add everything that I've read so that you can follow up. And if you have anything helpful to add, feel free to do so. Alright. Tata. Bye bye. Das vidaniya.